Welcome to USC Rossier's Leadership Month and today's special session, a conversation with Dean Pedro Noguera. Today's conversation will be moderated by Reveta Bowers, who serves as co-chair of the USC Rossier School of Education Board of Counselors. The Board of Counselors provides strategic advice, support, and assistance to ensure USC's Rossier role as a model education, research, and training institution for the 21st century and acts as advocates for the school's mission to prepare leaders to achieve educational equity through practice, research, and policy. The conversation today will feature many of the questions submitted in advance by our attendees through the registration process. And now I would like to introduce USC Rossier's new Dean, Pedro Noguera. Pedro A. Noguera is the Emory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. A sociologist, Dean Noguera's research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 13 books and has published over 250 research articles in academic journals, book chapters and edited volumes, research reports, and editorials in major newspapers. Dean Noguera serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations, including the Economic Policy Institute, the National Equity Project, and The Nation. He appears as a regular commentator on educational issues on several national media outlets, and his editorials on educational issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Dallas Morning News, and the Los Angeles Times. Prior to being appointed Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education, Dean Noguera served as a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Before joining the faculty at UCLA, he served as a tenured professor and holder of endowed chairs at New York University, Harvard University, and the University of California, Berkeley. It is now my pleasure to join you in welcoming Dean Noguera, who will deliver some opening remarks.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for this opportunity to address our alumni. And I hear there's some incoming students out there too that have joined us for this conversation. So welcome to the new students and welcome to the alumni as well. It's an honor to be the new Dean at the Rossier School and to have a chance to lead during this very challenging time. I was hoping that I'd be in my office in Wade Phillips Hall, but I've only gotten to see it once so far and haven't met too many of the staff or faculty yet in person, but hopefully in the next few months that'll change and we'll get together again. So in the meantime, we have to rely on this medium to communicate. And I'm finding increasingly that it's not so bad, although you do get tired of sitting in front of a screen after a while. So once again, we find ourselves with education in the news. It's on the front pages of every major newspaper because we finally figured out the economy can't start unless schools reopen. But we know now that there are real challenges with reopening schools because we don't know how to do it safely. And just yesterday, LA Unified announced that, and San Diego, they will not hold schools in person, but do it online. And this has exposed the deep inequities that we have in our society with respect to access to learning, access even to screen devices. But those inequities also are very much present in the way this virus has afflicted us and who's at greatest risk. One of the ironies is that those we call the essential workers are often the least paid workers in our society. And they're the ones risking our lives to prepare our food and to collect them in the fields. And so as a nation, we're grappling with what to do. And schools are being called on to help figure it out. And so I like to remind people often that education always has two purposes. One is to prepare young people for the world as it is, to make sure they have the skills and the tools to participate fully, to get jobs, to participate in our democracy. But education must also play another role, and that is to make the world better. to solve the problems of previous generations. And to do that, education must tap into the critical thinking and creativity of our students so that they can develop new ideas, new ways of approaching old problems, so that we can have a brighter future. I want you to think about that as we think about leadership and what kind of leaders are we preparing for the world today and the challenges we face. Those are issues that weigh heavily on me as I think about what it means now to assume leadership here at Rossier, and I'm sure it weighs on especially those of you who are out there working in our schools. So to open up our conversation today, we have a proven school leader, Reveta Bowers, who is also the head of our Board of Counselors. She has been brought back to lead the school she founded because they could think of no one better during this period of uncertainty to turn leadership over. So Reveta, thank you for joining me in this conversation today, and I turn it over to you.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be here. And we have a number of questions to begin this conversation. But the first question is, you've readily admitted you've never been a dean before. So how have your previous leadership experiences prepared you for this job?
Thank you, Reveta, for the question. So although I haven't been a dean, I have held a number of leadership roles. So for example, for 4 years, in the early 90s, I served on the school board in Berkeley, California, and served as president of the board for part of that time. And probably many of the listeners out there too young to know, but those were very difficult times in California. We were cutting all kinds of essential programs because we were in the midst of a recession. And I remember shortly after being elected, thinking I had made a huge mistake because it was a 4-year term. I came to regard as a 4-year sentence on the board. But I learned so much about education in that role. I learned that the status quo was not working for so many of our kids. I also learned that policy making at the local level is so hard because you have to be accountable to your constituents, to the teachers that work for you, to the administrators, to the parents, and to the students themselves. And making tough decisions in that climate taught me a lot about the importance of listening, of being responsive to a community. I remember at one point we were faced with a tough decision about our music program. And you know, it's often the case that whenever the budget gets tight, one of the first things we eliminate is music and art. And we fought to keep music in Berkeley because we knew how important it was for children. And it made us cut other things because we were still working with a finite budget. But I draw on that experience, and I could cite others that have taught me that part of being a leader is being able to lead with values, being clear about what your values are, what matters to people. Because if you lose sight of that, I think we're all in trouble.
Yeah. You're right. So what attracted you to the role of Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education? Why here?
Why here? Well, I guess the short, funny answer is that I hadn't been at UCLA long enough to develop a strong sense of loyalty. So I didn't feel like a traitor in coming over. But more seriously, I saw it as a great opportunity. For much of my career, I've been a scholar who has done research and writing about the major issues facing our schools. I've not done that from the comfort of my office, but I've been in schools. I've worked in communities throughout the country and really throughout the world. And I enjoyed that work thoroughly. But at this point in my career, I feel it's time to really give back to make sure that I can contribute to addressing the challenges facing American education, especially because despite our wealth as a country, despite the great universities we have, and despite the technology, we still have so many schools that are not meeting the needs of kids. And I think I know something about that from having worked in schools that do. You know, one of the great things is I can name schools across the country in some of our poorest communities that serve kids well. And I point to those schools over and over again to let people know it can be done. We can do this. when we get the conditions right. And it's focusing on how to get those conditions right, which I believe is the true challenge of leadership. So my hope is that Rossier can be a leader in doing that for school districts across the country and beyond, because I think there's a critical need now for ideas and for making research available to educators who are out there addressing so many complex and very difficult issues.
Right. Well, you're certainly taking the helm at an unprecedented time, with a global pandemic, racial inequity at the forefront of our thoughts. How are you responding to current challenges? There are so many of them.
You know, the one thing about these challenges is they affect everybody. So there's no need for me to feel like they're just mine. You know, the uncertainty of this moment affects all of us. There are many people out there who don't know how they're going to pay their bills, don't know how they're going to put food on the table. So the challenges I face as a dean are not unique by any means. And the truth is, Karen Gallagher left the school in great shape, financially, but also she built great programs, and the alumni that are out there are proof of her legacy. So I get a chance to build on that legacy. And so I thank Karen for what she's done. And it doesn't mean I'm not daunted by the challenge of this moment. If I weren't, I'd be naive. These are very difficult times in which to think about leading a school, particularly a private school, and where our fees are so high. So how do we support our students who we know are going to work in education and be saddled with great debt for years to come? So these are great challenges, but I see them as challenges. I don't see them as burdens. I think there are opportunities here too. And my goal is to seize the opportunities so we can address those challenges.
So let's dig a little deeper into who you are. As you think about your lived experiences, what would you like people to really know about you?
Well, I would say, first and foremost, I'm a parent. And as a parent of 5, grandparent of 4, I know and understand how hard it is to raise kids and in these very uncertain times we're in. And I start there because I think that if we approached and looked at issues of education from the standpoint of a parent, we would understand the concerns many parents have about their children. Because every parent wants the best for their child and should get that. And we need to always keep that in mind. But beyond being a parent, I've also been a teacher. I've taught in Providence, Rhode Island. I've taught in Oakland and Berkeley, California. I've taught in schools that were regarded as the worst. I remember when I taught at Central High School in Providence, I was told by my advisor, he said, you know, Central is the worst school in the city. And when I got there and found out I would be teaching American history, I was delighted because I loved history. And I thought, what a great opportunity to teach history to these students and to make it meaningful so that they come to love history as much as I do. And so even when I've been faced with difficult challenges, I've learned from those experiences. And I've learned that you can, in fact, use education to make a difference, because once you have willing students, great things are possible. The real challenge for an educator is how do you use education to let students see their potential and develop their talents and empower them as learners so that they can use education to improve their lives and hopefully make a difference for others. So I have a great passion for that work, and it's what keeps me in this field and keeps me feeling like this is still great work to be part of.
Right. Well said. So now we're going to go to a part of the program where we had lots and lots of questions submitted in advance by participants. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So the first is, what theories or models of leadership or management do you subscribe to?
So there are a few. First, and I would say, I worked when I was at Harvard with a guy named Ron Heifetz. And some of the leaders out there will know his work. He wrote a book called Leadership on the Line and a couple others. And he headed the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard. And most of his experience was with business leaders and political leaders. But he and I together developed a program to train superintendents. And we work with 15 school districts, 15 superintendents around the country. And we took his notion of adaptive leadership and applied it to working with these superintendents. And that to me has stuck with me. It's something I still draw on today because I think in education especially, and right now you are seeing it on clear display, it's very easy to be preoccupied with the technical aspects of your job, right? You're running a system, you have to handle human resources and make sure that the system itself is working, that the bills are paid, that you're in compliance with policy. Those are the technical aspects of the job. Right now, the technical focus is on how to open schools safely. But the technical part of the job is only part of the job. The other part is the adaptive part. And the adaptive part can't be done from your office. It has to be done in relationship, direct relationship with your teachers, with your students, with the parents you serve. And it's adaptive because what worked yesterday may not work the next day. You have to reflect on what you're doing. You have to be aware of where you're trying to go. You have to have a vision, and you have to be willing to tinker with that vision based on new information and new facts on the ground. And that notion of being an adaptive leader has stuck with me, and I think particularly now in this role, because we're dealing with so much uncertainty. So it's something I draw upon frequently. And then I work closely with the dean there at Harvard, a guy named Jerry Murphy. And we worked training principals at the time. And I heard, he said something that I thought that stuck with me. He said, you know, the most important thing for a school leader to have is good judgment. And that's the hardest thing to teach. Right? How do you teach discretion? How do you teach a person to make good decisions when there are none immediately apparent to you? And the metaphor he used was that being a school principal is like being a sea captain. You know, a sea captain has to make decisions that life or death. You know, if the storm is brewing, do you go out further? Do you go back? If you've got a breakdown on the boat, how do you handle it? Some of the things you can't prepare for. It's all about judgment. And I think that I've seen leaders in the field who have good judgment, and I often wonder, where do they get that? How do they know to handle that particular employee in that way, or that irate parent in that manner? And it's, again, something that stuck with me because I think that a dean certainly has to have good judgment and discretion, especially at times like these. So those are two frameworks I've drawn upon and continue to do so.
So certainly today in particular, and over time, our views about what it means to be a leader and who can lead have evolved. When you think about what's needed today, what kind of leadership really comes to mind as being necessary for these times?
So I'll go back to something I said earlier about values. I think moral leadership right now is such a critical need. And by moral leadership, what I mean is leaders who remind us of our common values, values of fairness, of justice, of equity, of integrity, because I think there's such a demand and a clamor out there for that kind of leadership. And what I've experienced, because when we could travel, I used to travel a lot, all around the country and around the world. When you speak to those kinds of core values, they transcend our differences of politics, differences of race, because they resonate to something important about our humanity. I actually wrote a book about pursuing our common humanity, because I think that when we do that, we're in a better position to solve our common problems. And so I think it's moral leadership that's really called for at this time, and I hope I can provide some of it.
I'm sure you can. So do you perceive that the educational landscape will be changed as a result of the pandemic? And if so, how?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about that too, because I hope it will. I hope that the pandemic is actually an opportunity for a reset. because many of the things we've been doing weren't working very well for lots of people. For lots of kids who are alienated, bored, just not thoroughly engaged. How often does a kid come home at the end of the day and say, wow, what a day. I learned so much. I was so inspired. You know, that should happen.
Yeah.
Education, you know, a good education makes a person want more education.
Right.
And that's what we should be after.
Right.
So, yeah, I have had the experience of working in schools around the country that do inspire me. And I hope to draw upon those examples at Rossier to, again, remind people of what's possible, because I think that the traditions in many of our schools are precisely what we have to change. You know, I spent a lot of time, for example, on school discipline. And I know from the research, because I've done a lot of the research, we are most likely to punish the kids with the greatest needs.
Right.
All you have to do is look at your data and you see they're the kids with with learning disabilities. They're the kids in foster care, in group homes, right? And disproportionately, they're Black children, poor children. And part of that is because we respond to behavior, but we don't address the need. And if you don't address the need, the behavior problems don't go away. You know, if you think about the fact that we actually suspend kids who don't like school, right? Think about that. And it's not to say there isn't a need at times to give kids a cooling off period. There is. But if that's the only tool in our tool shed, then we have a problem, because as Lawrence Kohlberg, a great psychologist, said many years ago, the goal of discipline is not to teach kids to avoid punishment. It's to teach kids to do what's right, even when adults aren't looking. Which is a much higher standard. It means you actually have to lead with values. You have to reinforce values. You have to keep kids connected to learning. So my hope is that this pandemic is an opportunity to reset, to create schools that are caring communities where we address the needs of the whole child, the social, the emotional, the psychological needs, where we focus much more on getting kids engaged as learners, and we bring the joy of learning to schools, because it should not be that education is a drag for people. It should be a source of empowerment. And so I'm hoping that Rossier can play a role in helping schools to do that reset, so that schools can be better than they were and not merely a return to normal.
Our next question is very specific about change. It says, do you believe that traditional public schools are capable of change with regard to school schedules and calendars?
Yes, because I've seen it happen. The problem is I haven't seen it happen enough.
Right.
And so I can name a school. There's a school in Colorado I've worked with. I can't remember, I blank out the name right now. It's in Denver. They changed the schedule. You know, they have a staggered schedule. Some teachers start the day at 7:30. Some teachers start the day at 9:30. So do some kids. And they do it because they know that some kids aren't awake at 9:30, at 7:30 in the morning. And so they need a staggered schedule. They also have a longer year. So the schedule matches the needs of the community, not the master scheduler. And it sounds trite, but it makes a huge difference, because it allows schools to be more responsive to the needs of the people they serve. So yes, it's possible. The question is, can you take innovations like that to scale, so that it's happening not just in one or two places, but in many places? That's where it gets harder. And that's an issue I've thought a lot about. How do you take good ideas and bring them to bear on whole systems? But it's something I want to work on together with Rossier. Just before joining Rossier as the dean, I had been asked to serve as an advisor to the governor of New Mexico. And New Mexico, some of you may know, is the saying they used to have there is, thank God for Mississippi, because Mississippi was the only state that performed worse than New Mexico. Well, Mississippi now outperforms New Mexico. And they've been searching for ways to really move it forward. And the governor knows that it's not simply about putting pressure on the educators. That's what we've done. We've used threats and pressure. It's not worked. What they're now embarked on is how to build capacity so that we actually give clear guidance to educators about how to do the very complex work they're undertaking. And so seeing that happen in a place like New Mexico, where there are huge challenges, especially on the reservations in the state, is again something I think we can learn from, because we have to think about how do we bring good education in all corners of this country, starting in our backyard right there in Los Angeles.
Great. So here's a question. If it's not on every teacher's mind, it probably should be. How can we put equity at the center of teaching? And what can school administrators do to foster equity and understanding?
So again, I would say every parent of more than one child already practices equity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because they're not all the same. Even identical twins are not the same. As I said already, I have 5 children, so I'm an equity expert. And my children go from age 37, the oldest, to age 8. Right? That's quite a span. That's a longer story about how I pulled that off. But what I've learned is that our job as parents is to try to meet the different needs of your different children. That's the same job of a teacher or of a principal. Now, it's harder when you have a lot more kids. But if you have the mindset, I'm going to treat them the way I want my children to be treated,
right,
it starts to shift the way we approach working with kids, the kindness we show, the care we show, and the acknowledgement that they're all different. They come with different personalities, different temperament. We tend too often to see kids through labels, through their test scores, through the categories we put them in, and fail to see the whole person. And I would say if we started by asking more basic fundamental questions, like who are these kids? What are their needs? What are their interests? How do we get them motivated and engaged? Our schools would look very different, because we would design schools and design the curriculum even to engage those kids that we're serving much more deeply than we do now.
Right. Now, here's a question that I think every new leader anticipates being asked. And I've often found it a really insightful question, which is, what is your vision for Rossier?
So my vision, it's a vision and a hope. My vision is that Rossier can be that kind of beacon of advice, of guidance, of help to schools around the country. That when they hear Rossier, they say, help is at Rossier. If we have a problem, that's the place to go, because Rossier is staffed with brilliant researchers and scholars who are grappling with the important issues of the day, and we are, right? So it's not as though this is such a tall leap. We already have researchers doing cutting-edge research. Now what we have to focus on is how to make that work available in ways that allow us to move practice. So that's my vision, is to really be a resource. And not only for the educators, but for policymakers as well. I want governors to turn to us and say, we're grappling with difficult issues here in Arkansas or Texas, not just California, and we know Rossier is a place where we can get some help. If that happens, then I think Rossier will really be positioned to have great impact. And at this stage of my career, impact is my greatest priority.
Absolutely, absolutely. So as you think about all the things in your vision and all your hopes for Rossier, what do you think is going to be your greatest challenge?
Well, I often say to the leaders I work with that if it's only your vision, then it's just it's a dream. It's got to be a shared vision, right? Because if it's not a shared vision, then you can't move the whole team in a common direction. That's where real power is. Great schools have to be greater than the sum of their parts. Because if we're all working together, we can achieve so much more than if each person is doing their own thing. And that's hard. I know from my experience at many universities that, you know, every faculty member wants to do their work. We tend to have tunnel vision. We tend to work in silos and in very fragmented ways. So I have to spend time getting to know the staff and the faculty at Rossier, getting them, hearing them, listening to them, so that we come out of it with a shared vision and a shared plan of action. So it's not just mine, it's ours. And I believe if I can do that work with my colleagues, that we can be a really influential institution. And I believe that that's possible.
So how do we take the themes of education into other settings, such as business and government?
Well, you know, I'm borrowing here from Ted Sizer, who was an old friend, and I knew for many years. He wrote several books and led the Coalition of Essential Schools. And Ted used to say that schools have to be thinking organizations. And he said, teaching is intellectual work first and foremost. And what that reminds us of is you've got to reflect on what you're doing. And that's as true in education as it is in healthcare or in business. If you're not thinking about what you're doing, then chances are you will eventually become obsolete. You will eventually no longer meet the needs of your consumers or of your market because you haven't adapted to that market. And so it goes back to what I said before about adaptive leadership. That principle works in many fields. And when we don't see it at work, we see industries in trouble. So Reveta, like me, you probably remember when Sears was a great department store.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Where that was the go-to place. JCPenney, go-to place. Well, neither of those are the go-to place anymore. And part of that is their inability to adapt. It's also because of the marketplace and competition from the big suppliers like Amazon and Walmart. But it's a reminder that if you don't adapt to the times, you run the risk of becoming obsolete. Schools face the same challenge. Think about schools that have lost kids because the parents have chosen to send their kids elsewhere. And they are faced with dwindling resources because they haven't found ways to adapt to the needs of their students. So I think those principles apply in education and in other sectors as well.
So Rossier and USC sit in the heart of this city. And of course, the Rossier building is the tallest building on the USC campus. So I like to think of it as a beacon. But as you think about the educational landscape in Los Angeles, there are so many different kinds of schools and so many paths that educators can take. Large public school districts, small districts surrounding. There are charter schools, there are for-profit schools, there are independent schools, parochial schools, private schools. How do we make a Rossier education in our graduate school relevant for all the different kinds of educators and all of the different kinds of paths they take in their careers?
So a couple of years ago, while I was still at UCLA, we had formed a network. The network was called the School Improvement Network. And we had traditional public schools, charter schools, independent schools in that network. It was 15 schools altogether, high schools throughout LA. And the focus of the network was how to improve performance in ninth grade math. We kept it very practical. And we focused on ninth grade math because we know that is the gateway course to college. If you can get kids through at least algebra, if not geometry in ninth grade, they're on the path to college. And many of the schools in that network were struggling. And we had educators in the room together from different kinds of schools who had never talked to each other, even though they were doing very similar work. And it was powerful. The problem was we couldn't get the funding to sustain it. My hope is that at Rossier, Rossier can be that convener, bring schools of different kinds together to talk about common problems of practice. Because the challenges you face at an independent school are not unlike, although the context is different, issues of serving kids in public schools. And so breaking those silos down, I think, is a critical role that Rossier can play. So again, that we can share good ideas and make them available to others.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions that have been put up in the chat. So here's a question submitted during our session. What is your vision for how technology can be used to enhance the classroom experience for students and teachers?
So that's an interesting question because I believe technology is a very important tool, but not a panacea.
Right.
And I get concerned sometimes that it's presented as a panacea. That is that, you know, I hope I don't offend anyone, but there was a time not that long ago in LA where they were ready to give everybody iPads in the schools. And the irony was they didn't even think through how to make sure kids couldn't get on Facebook in class with those iPads, or train the teachers on how to teach the iPads because the kids knew more about the devices than the teachers did. So I think that if we use technology as a tool to facilitate learning, and I've seen some great examples of software. Many of you out there know about the Khan Academy. There are great ways in which we can use technology to facilitate learning, and we're going to need to, because we're going to have more and more people online doing distance learning. So we're going to need to figure out how to use it well as a medium, but we should never lapse into thinking that it's going to solve all our problems. And I get worried about that. There's great concern out there that there are a lot of kids who become addicted to the technology, their screens. I can't tell you often I go to the park and I'll see kids in the park on their devices. So instead of playing, they're on their devices. I was at the beach the other day, and beautiful day, water's beautiful, and I see a group of young women on the beach, and they're all on their phones. It's like, wow, you could have done that at home, and here you are on the beach, and you're missing it. So yeah. I think there's also a danger that technology can suck us in ways that prevent us from being fully human. When I was a kid, I played outside. I remember I grew up in New York, and we'd play even when it was freezing outside. We'd come inside with numb hands, and even though we were crying from the cold, we loved it because we wanted to be outdoors. And I get concerned. I don't see kids playing. And I know parents are worried about safety, but God, kids need to play. They need to experience the environment, the world. They need to work things out with each other. We used to play baseball. No one was there to coach us. We had to pick teams and figure it out. You learn about each other. You learn about some social relationships through play. And so I worry that technology can also be overused and contribute to a kind of dependency on it that does worry me and concern me.
Or that social media will take the place of relationships.
Absolutely.
That it's critically important for kids to develop.
I mean, think about how many kids get
We have a question about higher ed.
Sure.
We talked a lot about K through 12 education. Would you please discuss the current status and vision for Rossier's EDD and PhD higher education programs?
So I'm still learning about both of those. And so I don't want to even offer any kind of judgment about where we are. I'm proud of the fact that we educate so many future leaders. And so I want to learn more about what's distinct about what we provide. Given that it costs a lot to go to Rossier, we better make sure that any leader coming out of Rossier is top notch. And definitely has no trouble getting a job because people know that brand, that Rossier really represents something important. So I want to look closely at what we do in all of our programs, our doctoral programs, particularly and master's programs as well, to make sure it's high quality, to make sure that what we provide to our students is the very best so that we're producing leaders and researchers who really can go out there into the world and address the difficult challenges we face. But I don't know yet enough about where we are and where we might have areas of growth.
So the topic of social justice is so prevalent in today's news, locally, at the state level, nationally, all over the world, there's talk of social justice. How will you address the social justice issues of today as dean? And how may that reflect in the education and training of the students at USC?
So this is an issue we have to take on. I've thought a lot about it during this racial justice movement after the killing of George Floyd. And I thought, what would have happened if schools had been in session when that murder took place? Mm-hmm. Because kids saw it. It was on social media. You could literally see this man being murdered. They would have come to school with questions. They would have come to school wanting to talk about it. And I believe a lot of schools would not have been ready for that conversation. And that, I think, represents a huge challenge, because our schools should be able to help kids make clear ethical judgments about issues like these, and to develop informed opinions about what to do. An education that doesn't do that, I think, is not one that's worth its degree. So I'll just share this. There's a quote, and I'll paraphrase it, from a Holocaust survivor, and it's written as a letter to a teacher. And she says, "Dear teacher, I am suspicious of education." She says, "Suspicious of education because the doctors who tortured us were very well educated. And the gas chambers were designed by very well educated engineers. And an education that is not grounded in human values will produce more Eichmanns." And I want you to think about that for a moment, because I think too often we disassociate values from education. And we're living at a time, again, where we have to be very clear about our values, about justice. And so I believe that as educators, we have to clarify our own values, our own stance on these issues. We can't be ambivalent. We can't be neutral in the face of great injustice. At the same time, we also have to keep clear about what is our role. It's not to teach people what to think, but hopefully how to think, how to get good information, how to be critical in the way we approach the consumption, because we know there's a lot of manipulation on social media. And so I think it's a challenging time. This movement has drawn our attention to structural racism in our society that's pervasive, rooted in our history. And that also is an educational challenge. What do we do about it? And I think many people will look to not only to our schools, but to our universities for help on how to address these very, very important issues. And I believe Rossier can play a role.
Right. I think really great universities, and particularly schools of education, have some advocacy responsibilities in today's society too. So as you think about engaging community partners, how do you think we could engage them to support innovation for our schools? Because we know that there are high costs for innovation, and yet that innovation is necessary in terms of preparing the next workforce and preparing kids for education beyond the K-12 environment.
So in the coming year, my first year, and maybe longer, I want to engage thought leaders in education, but also in media and technology, in a conversation about reimagining education, reimagining learning. Because I think that some of the greatest innovation sadly doesn't exist in education, it exists in media and technology. We need to bring that way of thinking, way of seeing things differently into education, because I think in too many ways we're stuck. We're stuck in the way we approach things and the way we deliver instruction. And so I want to engage thought leaders from various fields in a conversation, how to do things differently, how to get kids more engaged so we tap into that curiosity that kids have, how to create schools where kids are inspired, and then how do we do that at scale so it doesn't just exist in schools like yours, but in lots of schools throughout the country. And that's a political challenge, and I know that. So I want to engage policymakers as well in this conversation, because I think we can't have innovation in silos. We need to have it occur in many places. So Look out, you could tell the listeners out there to look out for news that'll be coming out in the next few weeks about how that conversation will take place. It'll, of course, take place in this format online, but that'll make it easier, hopefully, for lots of people to plug in and to listen and to also pose you questions.
So you talked early on about the discipline systems that you had seen in schools, targeting the kids who most needed to be in schools. So how do we effectively train school leaders to support underserved students?
So it goes back to what I said before, when we were talking before about putting equity at the center. When you put equity at the center, then you realize we have to serve all the kids, not just those who are easiest to serve.
Right.
That's the sad thing. In a lot of schools, we're good at serving the kids who don't need much help. The kids who have lots of support at home, whose parents have invested a lot of resource in those kids. And part of the reason why we're good at serving them is because they don't need as much help and the parents are doing most of the work. We really make a difference when we're able to reach the kids who don't have that kind of support. Kids like I was, who needed to be introduced to the love of reading. And that happened for me, fortunately, when I was 8 years old. And my father had, my parents used to make us go to the library after our chores. My father used to teach us, he said, you could get a free education with a library card.
Right.
And he practiced it. He was a very well-read person. And when I was a little boy, about 8 years old, I went to the library one day, and the librarian there, she took time to talk to me, find out what I was interested in, and then she introduced me to a book. It was A Wrinkle in Time. Right? Oh. And I would have never read that book because I didn't like science fiction. I didn't like the cover, and I did judge books by their cover. I didn't like that the lead character was a girl, but I liked the librarian. I trusted her. And so I read the book, and I couldn't put it down. A week later, I was done, and I was back for more. Mm-hmm. And I cite that because I think we make education harder than it should be. Mm-hmm. If we tap into the natural curiosity of kids, kids will become self-motivated learners. And that's what we should be focused on.
Right. So I'm a fourth generation educator in my family. Mother was a teacher, my aunt's grandmother, great-grandmother. How do we make education the most sought after and respected profession in this country? Because I think we need our educators to be respected and we need them to be seen as professionals. How do we go about changing perception about becoming teachers?
That's a tough one. We saw teachers strike in states across the country just a couple of years ago, in Oklahoma, West Virginia, Arizona. It shouldn't be that you have to go out on strike just to get a decent wage. It shouldn't be that teachers are on food lines to make ends meet. It's just a travesty. So, I think part of what we have to do is, as a school of education, just kind of inform the broader public about why this work in education is so important. I really do believe the future of this country will be determined by what happens in our schools.
Right.
It's that important. If we want kids who are going to grapple with issues like climate change and inequality, then they need a great education. And the people who teach them need to be respected, they need to be compensated, they need to be recognized for how important the work they do is. And so at USC, we have to play a role. And I know I just had a conversation today with our president, Carol Foltz. She gets it. She understands it. We need to spread the word, support your teachers. You believe in education, then show it by supporting our teachers, because it should not be that when a young person tells their parents, I'm going to be a teacher, the parent says, well, what a shame, because you had so much more potential. We should say, wow, what a dignified profession. What a way to make a difference, because it really is. So we have a lot of work to do in that regard.
I know that Rossier is engaged in some really cutting edge research. And I think some of the most promising research that's been helpful to education in the last few years has been our understanding of brain research. As you think about the implications for what we're beginning to understand about how the brain works, what excites you most about that education and how it's applicable to schools everywhere?
So I won't pretend to be a neuroscientist. I'm not, but I know enough to know this, that increasingly the neuroscientists are using a term called neuroplasticity, right? That is the idea that instead of the brain being fixed, and many of us grew up at a time where teachers would tell you, well, you're gifted or you're not. And they'd make that judgment very early about kids. And if you were seen as gifted, you were placed on one track. And if you were seen giftless, another track. And what the neuroscience is telling us is that the brain is like a muscle. The brain has to be worked. All children have to be stimulated. All children have to be challenged. We can't afford to make those early judgments about kids. And so that research, I think, is very helpful because it's reminding us of the importance of addressing the basic needs of kids, but also of challenging each and every child so that they all come away stimulated and they all come away appreciating the importance of learning. But we need to recognize that kids who come to us hungry with basic needs not met, often those needs will overshadow the learning potential in that child. And we can't allow that to happen.
Right. So one of my goals for this year as a school site leader is to really allow for some really hard conversations, some difficult, challenging, but stimulating conversations around issues of equity and racism among our faculty, our staff, our students, and our parents. How can you have those same kind of conversations in Rossier?
Well, we started this week. I want to really applaud, I'm blanking on Darlene, her last name, Robles, I think, is, yes, the Associate Dean, a former superintendent herself. She's leading, along with the Diversity Inclusion Committee at Rossier, a conversation over a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And I joined in on that first conversation, and it's in small groups. And we're discussing the ideas in the book and connecting them back to our work and our lived experience. Now, I know enough to know that this kind of conversation is not like magic. It's not like you have this conversation, suddenly you're transformed and you're no longer biased. Because the biases we hold, and all of us hold them, we've acquired over a lifetime. So unlearning them takes time too. But sure. I believe that if we can sustain that kind of conversation, but most importantly, connect it to the work we do. So it's not an abstract conversation, but how does that show up in our teaching? How does it show up in our work with schools? Then I think there's great potential for Rossier being a leader in this work as well. So I'm encouraged to see it started before I got here, and I'm going to make sure it continues.
You know, as I think about some of the issues and some of the skills that are so needed in order to teach today's youth, media literacy is right there at the top of the list, because so many students in our schools are believing what they read because it's written. Yeah. How do we help the next generation of teachers and school leaders embrace the need for media literacy and develop the tools and the curricula to teach it?
So we have to recognize that it's got to be integral. If kids are acquiring so much of their information, and it's not just kids, adults too, from social media, if video games, right now, video games are premiering like movies. So we have to recognize that gaming is a part of the life experience of more and more kids. Then we have to teach kids how to be critical consumers of that information. And you know, I have colleagues that have been working in this field for a while, and one of the things we know is that when you give kids a chance to question what they're watching, question what they're seeing online, it gives them the ability to detach and not simply get immersed in it, and that detachment allows them to critique and allows them to ask questions. What is this gamer trying to get me to experience here? What is this? What's the source of this information? Is it a reliable source? Can it be verified someplace else? When we give kids tools like that, they are going to be in a better position not to be manipulated. And
Right.
that, I think, is a critical challenge for our democracy today.
Okay. So as you think about the job you've taken on, what are you going to get up and do tomorrow?
I think I'll be doing more Zooms tomorrow. That's all I do all day long is Zoom meetings. But you know, I'm trying to find the right balance between meeting and getting to know Rossier. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity with you, Reveta, today to at least give the alumni a chance to get to know me. And hopefully I'll get to meet many of you when we can travel again and get out there. But I want to do that with the staff and faculty at Rossier. I've started to meet a few of them, and many of them have reached out to me. And but it's going to take time. But I'm looking forward to it because I don't think you could be a good leader unless you know the people, unless they know you. You build trust because that's what makes it possible for us to do great things together. So that's the work I've embarked on.
You know, at the intersection of innovation and transformative education, there's a huge place and a need for philanthropy, you know, and engaging donors and people who want to invest not just in business, but in the business of education, in our schools, in our teachers, in their development and practice, in our research. What would you want to say to people that come to you and want to invest in education? How would you prioritize the needs?
So just as an aside and answering your question there, Reveta, one of the things I hated about politics, and one of the reasons why I decided never to go into politics after my term on the school board, is I hated begging for money. Every time you have to raise money for your campaign, I hated that. I don't mind raising money for education and for the mission of Rossier. And you know, one of the things I'll tell, and those of you with deep pockets out there who are listening, you know, my priority is to raise money to support our students. We have many students out there who are going to struggle to pay fees at USC. They're going to go into education that's not where they're not going to get paid a lot of money. We need to find ways to reduce that cost so they're not saddled with debt for the next several years. So that's my number one priority. And I have no objection to asking because it's not for me. It's for the next generation of educational leaders and scholars out there. And we live at a time where we need those people. So, you know, there have other initiatives. Karen Gallagher started an initiative for women leaders, which I'm so impressed with because I want to see more women in leadership roles. So you know, I think the challenge is going to be to raise the funds. But I think when you have, you know, good programs, good ideas, good people, it's not as hard because there's still lots of money in this country.
Right. A very wise board member once said to me, "You are the chief storyteller of the school. When you go to ask for something, you just have to be very good at telling the story of the school and making those stories relevant to the person who wants to help." Yeah. You're going to be a masterful storyteller. Well, and I'm sure very soon you're going to have wonderful, wonderful stories to tell. But is there anything, we've had a wide-ranging conversation today. Is there anything that you haven't been asked that you wish you had been, that you'd like to talk about?
I wonder. We did cover a lot of territory in this time. That one stumped me because we covered so much. But maybe there's somebody out there who has a question. I don't know. I see you've been fielding them.
Yeah, let me see what's out there. We've gotten a lot of them. Oh, here's a nice comment. It's a thank you from someone who says, "I credit my Rossier education with my ability to succeed in adapting and evolving to wild and broad changes in my work and industry. Thank you."
Well, that's good. That's very encouraging.
Yeah, yeah. So there's much work to be done.
Much work to be done.
a new culture to understand the culture and the unique ethos of an institution will unfold as you begin your work. Would you leave us with one thought that you hope this audience will take away and share with 5 more people that you would want them to know about a Rossier education?
Well,
because that's their homework.
Yeah. I hope a Rossier education provides our students, when they go out into the world as professionals, with not only solid training so that they can do their jobs to the best of their ability, but with also clarity on why this work in education is so important, so they can, in fact, make a difference. I often say that, especially for educational leaders, it's very easy to spend most of your time reacting to what comes at you. That prevents you from being a proactive leader and from addressing the more challenging issues we face. So my hope is that students coming from Rossier will be ready for that, to do that as well, and that they will bring joy to the work. And I don't say that in a trivial manner. I do believe that when we're doing work that's important with people who share our goals, that there can be joy in the work, that we can enjoy what we're doing, enjoy the fact that we're doing it together. We can laugh, and laughter is so important, because in these times when there's so much to be worried about, we also have to remember that life is precious and that this opportunity we have to make a difference is special. And so I hope that Rossier graduates come out with that understanding so that they can, in fact, be seen as leaders who can make a difference.
Hear, 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 hear. You know, as we think about how school districts are going to start this year, and all kinds of schools across the country, we know that many of them will have no choice but to do it remotely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great challenges of a remote or virtual or distance learning education is that we lose the relational aspect that makes schools so important. The relationships of kids and teachers, of teachers and teachers, of parents with teachers and kids in school. Is there one thought you'd like to give schools that have no choice but to start the year in remote education about how they can enhance that relational aspect of schools?
So I would say, just as you and I have done, I think demonstrate today that we can actually connect as people, even though we're doing it online, that's what we've got to do. We've got to connect as people first. What we teach is not the most important thing. It's who we teach it to. And if we can build that relationship, check in, how are you doing? Ask questions of our students to make sure they're okay, they're actually with us. Keep building those relationships, even doing it virtually. I think that it's going to make the whole experience better for everyone. So don't lose sight of the need for the human connection. I think it's so vital.
Thank you so much, Dean. This was a lovely, lovely afternoon. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Matt DeGroote to end our session today. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Reveta. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to ongoing work with you and the Board of Counselors.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Reveta, for guiding today's conversation, and to thank Dean Noguera for sharing information about your background, your thoughts on important issues facing education, and your hopes for our school. And we certainly look forward to hearing more from you in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you again for taking time out. And I'd like to thank everyone who is in attendance today, and wish you all a great evening. And as always, fight on.